Dr. Trevor Owens is a librarian, researcher, policymaker, and educator, advancing digital infrastructure and programs for libraries, archives, museums, and related cultural institutions. Owens serves as the Director of Digital Services at the Library of Congress. With nearly 100 employees, Digital Services is responsible for the Library of Congress's digital collections, digitization, discovery, and metadata management services. This includes internationally recognized web archiving and crowdsourcing programs. He is also a public historian in residence at American University, a lecturer for the University of Maryland's College of Information, and as a research affiliate with the Center for Archival Futures. He currently serves on the advisory board for the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media, on the review panel for digitizing hidden collections, amplifying unheard voices, and as a member of the Services Consultation Committee for Library and Archives Canada. Dr. Owens is also the author of 3 books, the most recent of which, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2018 and has won outstanding publication awards from both the American Library Association and the Society of American Archivists. He is working on completing his 4th book, After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory, which is under contract with the University of Michigan Press. His research and writing has been featured in Curator, the Museum Journal, Digital Humanities Quarterly, the Journal of Digital Humanities, DLib, Simulation and Gaming, Science Communication, New Directions in Folklore, and American Libraries. Let's please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Trevor Owens. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Owens.
Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here. And it looks like I need someone to give me the ability to share screen. It's grayed out for me. I don't know if I need to get promoted or something.
Let's see. We should be able to do that for you automatically. Hold on one second here. Try and find you in the participants list. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
It seems like all of our settings that we had for this meeting got reset. So I'm going to put you to participant and try that.
Great. Now I see it.
Perfect. Thank you.
All righty. Great. So hopefully you're seeing just one slide and not the presenter view mode thing. But in any event, thrilled to be here. And if there's any issues, technical issues with what's showing up or anything, just feel free to interrupt me and I can sort through it. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to share a little bit about ensuring enduring digital access. As noted, my most recent book from 2018 focuses on digital preservation, and the focus of my talk today is some of the sort of baseline principles and also some big picture issues in making sure that we can ensure enduring access to digital collections. And so I will dive right in. And my hope is that we have plenty of time for questions at the end, because that often ends up being the most interesting part of talking through this. But we'll work our way into it. So when it comes to digital preservation, it tends to be the case that there's 2 related competing ideas that come to mind. On the one hand, we see articles like this on a sort of rolling basis, things that show up and say, you know, what you put online is going to be there forever. Often this is sort of something that comes up to kind of scare young folks into thinking about what they put online, right? So there's this notion that digital material might be enduring in ways that we don't want, right? And at the same time, there's, you know, this was from 2018, but it's kind of a regular drumbeat that comes through public press every so often, that, you know, we may be coming towards a digital dark age. We might catastrophically lose all kinds of really important digital information. And we've now had probably, you know, if you want, you can find 20 years of these articles, maybe 30 years of these articles going back into the 90s, even the late 80s. But it's become an increasingly problematic issue for us to think about, right? And we're kind of pivoting back and forth between are we going to be stuck with everything forever, and are we going to lose everything all at once dramatically together? And that set of issues is really where I tried to bring my intervention with my book, The Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation, which in a big part of this book is drawing out the fact that we now have half a century of work from librarians, archivists, curators, a wide range of professionals working on ensuring long-term access to digital information that we can draw on, and that it really isn't the sort of hyperbole between losing everything or reluctantly having all kinds of things around that we don't want to have around. That we really do have a broad set of middle ground there around how to run, organize, and manage digital preservation for libraries, archives, and museums. And so, for context, that was the picture of the book right before, but the book is up and available as a preprint of the book is available for free online as an open access publication. So you don't need to buy the book to check it out. And any of you can go and download this and explore it. But I'll give a little bit of tour of the book, and then I'll dive into a bit of the sort of focus of what the rest of the talk is going to be. And so the points I was just making around getting beyond hype and anxiety around digital information is sort of starting point for the whole thing. Then delving into one of the big challenges that we're presented with digital preservation is that there's actually very different contexts in which we've worked and explored preservation over time. So everything from art conservation to preservation reformatting and microfilm to work on binding or environmental conditions, all these different areas, things around the creation of preserving oral histories by recording them and the history of recording technologies. There's just all these different lineages, and they kind of collapse all together into digital information at this point. And so a big challenge when we're talking about digital preservation is ironing out how those all fit together. Then the next chapter delves into kind of picking apart and understanding digital objects, drawing out what the sort of broad issues are for digital preservation. And the rest of the book sort of works phase by phase through digital preservation as craft, with the idea that it's not simply a technical set of questions, but really a broader set of issues that we can and should work through within the context of our own sort of professional judgment. And so the rest of the book through, preservation intent and collection development, setting up ways to manage copies and formats, arranging and describing materials, sort of works all the way down through to access of materials. And that's sort of an overview of how that book works. We use that now as a jumping off point for a roadmap for this talk. So I'm going to start out by going into a definition of digital preservation, sort of defining it in our context here, what we're talking about. And then I'm going to go through, the book opens with what I've heard from many people is the most useful resource of the book, which is a set of axioms or sort of first principles for thinking about digital preservation. I'm going to be selective in them. I'm not going to give you all 16 just because that can be a little overwhelming, but I'll sort of draw out some of the ones I think are the most important to kind of orient ourselves about, and that can also hopefully frame up some good context for having a little more discussion or talking through some questions any and all of you might have. And then I'll end with a short list of steps and resources that people around the world can use to improve digital preservation. So open resources that we can all use to sort of improve our practice and our craft in this case. So to start with, one of the first questions here is what is and isn't digital preservation? And for this, I like to pull up, for those who might not have seen the full reference model, this is the OAIS, the international standard for digital preservation, showing the connections between ingest, data management, archival storage, administration, preservation planning, and access. Or it's somewhat simpler, but still relatively complex model showing how an open archive system would function and work, the kinds of policy that's involved in running these sorts of systems. Now, these kinds of diagrams are really useful and powerful. They're important conceptual models, but I think they often can make it seem much more technical than it is, and also kind of obfuscate what the real issues at hand are. These are tools for thinking about and approaching digital preservation, but they're not necessarily most helpful for us. And so we'll start here by just thinking about digital preservation as really any and everything that you need to do to ensure enduring access to digital content. So this is everything from policy to infrastructure to financial resources to staff training, really the whole range of things that you use to enable access to digital content in the future, sort of today and well into the future. And so we've now worked through this kind of definitional bit here up front, and we can move into some highlights from these axioms for digital preservation. And this is really where we'll spend most of the time this morning in my presentation. These axioms are intended to sort of be useful principles for thinking about work around digital preservation, and also provocations to kind of think through. Some of them are intended to push back against some orthodoxy around thinking about digital preservation as systems or infrastructure or a primarily technical set of issues. But I will just roll straight into those. So the first one at the top of the list is that a repository is not a piece of software. That software doesn't really preserve anything. It can't function independently as a repository. That when we're thinking broadly about what a repository is, it's the sum of financial resources, hardware, staff time, and the ongoing work to implement policies, support planning to ensure long-term access to content. An important point with this too is that any software system you're using today is by necessity temporary. You're going to replace that software system with something else. So we're really thinking, and the same is true of the underlying hardware. So we're really ultimately thinking about managing continuity over time through different tools and systems. And with that, it's worth underscoring that often things like those OIAS requirements become the basis of sort of technical requirements for a system or something like that, with the idea that that system then does digital preservation. But it's important to remember, again, it's not the repository is always broader than any piece of technology. It is the whole sum and source of resources that go into the work of ensuring long-term access to digital information. So the second one is that it is institutions that make preservation possible. So the idea is that, each of us have limited lifetimes, and that if we ultimately want anything to persist beyond that, we're really looking at setting up systems and approaches that will help ensure things persist beyond that. And specifically with that too, that the durability of mediums for digital information is pretty low. So, we're looking at, while you could have, a diary in an attic that might sit there through 3 generations or something like that and get found when someone's going through their attic to sell their house or something like that. If you have if 3 generations from now, there's some hard drives or floppy disks up in some attic somewhere and someone pulls them out, the likelihood we could get any information of them is very low. So really any and everything that happens around digital preservation is tied up in getting data off of that media and ensuring it moves forward. But it's worth underscoring that the institutions that do this can be really broadly conceived. So everything from, libraries at every level, public, state, national, archives, museums, but even that, families and religious organizations, et cetera, that all of these are areas that can function as institutions that enable preservation. So within that too, that the design and functions of those institutions then becomes part of their repository capacities, right? Everything from their org charts, their hiring practices, their funding, credibility, those are all parts of the cultural machinery that makes preservation possible. The third one is that tools can get in the way just as much as they can help, which really relates in a lot of ways back to the first one. The idea that if you do have a really complex repository platform, it can make it hard to interact with and understand issues with your content. And in many cases, the best way to approach this, particularly if you're a smaller organization, is to start with small sort of approaches and practices around sets of files, file management, checking files, these kinds of things. Even just with a file system or some basic scripts, that it's often better to introduce that complexity over time, or approach these in multiple ways. So that idea that the tools can get in the way just as much as they can help. The fourth one is a little bit of almost like a koan or something you could kind of reflect or meditate on, that nothing has been preserved. There are only things being preserved. The idea here that preservation is always the result of ongoing work and commitment of resources. It's never finished. This really has a lot of ramifications for how we think about staffing and resourcing preservation work. Often work around digital systems and infrastructure for organizations based around an idea of kind of capital investments, that you're sort of almost like constructing a building or a facility, where in contrast, the work that's required to keep an ecosystem of digital tools and systems running is often much more a continually resourced activity. And so thinking about how to support the staffing that really makes that possible, and ongoing maintenance and management of digital collection systems and infrastructure becomes really important. In a slightly different direction, the fifth one is that hoarding is not preservation, which will, this one is not much of a reminder to archivists and librarians and cultural heritage professionals broadly, right? That we have a long standing set of practices and traditions around how to appraise, manage, organize, process collections. But it often comes up as an important point of context when we're talking with people outside of those traditions, or colleagues in IT or things like this, that just hoovering up huge amounts of data without having the ability to know the context of it and understand what's in it really isn't preservation. To be able to really genuinely be preserving something to enable access to it in the future requires an understanding of what it is, the nature of the material in it, and also the ethical obligations that come from an understanding of the scope and content that one is working with. So in this context, it's just as important as it ever was to have clear and coherent approaches to collection development, arrangement, description, and methods and approaches to provide access for everything. And this one relates closely with the sixth one, which is that backing up data is not digital preservation. Often when you talk about things around digital preservation with folks from IT departments or things like this, it can become a situation where someone sort of clarifies that they regularly back up all the data. But it's important for us to be able to explain why that's not sufficient for digital preservation, that the ability to sort of recover from backups, for a week or two of data is pretty fundamentally different than thinking about how to make sure that we can provide access to digital assets 50 or 100 years from now. So anything related to issues around, say, file formats or the sustainability of those formats, those kind of things become much longer term sets of issues than the kind of near pressing term of, can we recover all the files from a week or two ago? So that one's an important one for us to keep in mind. The next one is seven, is that the boundaries of digital objects are fuzzy. This is a little counterintuitive. We think about computing as being sort of very discrete and specific and determined, but in practice, actually pinning down the boundaries of digital objects can be quite challenging. So, you might think you have all the files for some piece of software or program on your computer, but it may well be the case that every time you open it, it makes a bunch of calls to the web and accesses a bunch of other resources. And the same is true if you're archiving websites, that actually knowing whether or not you've gotten an embedded video is challenging. Similarly, even opening this PowerPoint file, I think many of us have had these experiences where it'll say something like, the certain fonts aren't found, or there might be live linked images inside of something. And so actually knowing that you have sort of a fully contained copy of something ends up being challenging, and this is its own set of issues that you have to work with within digital preservation. Now, as I noted, I'm going to jump around a little bit, so we'll jump forward to number 9. And this one really, I think, reframes and underscores some points that came up in some of the earlier ones. The idea that digital preservation is fundamentally about making the best use of resources to mitigate threats and risks. So it's not so much an activity where you've kind of check all the boxes and you are thus doing digital preservation, but functionally it's more like something like cybersecurity, right? Where you are working through a threat model and thinking about what it is that might happen that would result in you losing your content or losing the ability to render the content. So this has, I think, 2 really important uses. One, it sort of broadens open all the questions about what digital preservation might be in the long term, about how to plan for it. But second, it also draws out that the important question is about what the right risk portfolio or set of risks are that you're willing to accept. So everything around how many copies of some set of files you keep, everything about whether or not they're geolocated, every question about sort of which file formats are likely to be the most renderable in the future. All of those are best understood as risks to think about and to sort of prioritize which of those are the most pressing risks. In that context, can be empowering too, in that it does mean that there's always things that can be done, that we can figure out how to sort of get the digital boxes off the floor. If you really only have one copy of some set of really important content, making a second copy of it and taking that copy home with you can dramatically decrease your sort of risk profile. And that kind of risk mindset is important to take into really every area of digital preservation work, which relates in a lot of ways to the point from the 11th one, that it's long past time to start taking actions. So there are a lot of complex things. I showed that complicated diagram at the front. There's a lot of complex schemas and ways to think about logging and tracking preservation actions. There's all these sorts of things, but those really won't help get the boxes off the floor, which is often the situation that many practitioners find themselves in. And so there are practical and pragmatic things that we can all be doing to mitigate some of those most pressing risks for loss. And we need to be working together to prioritize those within our organization as a sort of how we build digital preservation practice. And an example that I'll share here of a very concrete thing that sort of inspired this one. Years ago, I was at a conference talking with a colleague who worked in a small house museum about digital preservation, and they had invested some funds. They're really interested in learning more about digital preservation. They're going to a workshop about one of those complex schemas for logging and tracking preservation actions. When we talked about it a little more, it turned out the things they were the most concerned about was a set of really important oral history videos that they had recorded that were actually only kept on one workstation in the museum. So all of that material was really, one spilt cup of coffee or something like that away from being completely inaccessible, right? And so in that case, this is sort of underscoring the point that the most important thing to do then is not to go get some new training, not to learn about another sort of metadata system or schema, but in that case, the most pressing thing they could do was really to make backups of that set of really precious materials, whether it be sort of uploading them into some cloud storage system or, buying a hard drive and making a copy of them and taking them home. All kinds of things that can mitigate the most pressing risks, which is, one spilt cup of coffee or, a fire in a room that could have destroyed those materials. And that, I think, underscores how and where we can delve into and start making those really pressing actions. So then the last one that I'm going to share from this litany is the idea that it's really important for us all to accept and embrace the archival sliver. It's with digital information, it seems like it can be the case that we should be able to keep everything, that we could do things we've never done before. That sort of fits with that hype and that hyperbole that I was talking about in the beginning, that, could we save everything? And as I think is illustrated by a lot of what I've talked about through these principles, we haven't ever saved everything. And we aren't really in a position where we can do that now. It's not fundamentally different. It's actually very much the same. And so we're in a situation where we need to be thinking strategically about what really matters, what matters to our organizations, and make plans for how to approach the social, cultural challenges that come with the setting up and managing digital preservation programs to ensure that we're sort of rightly investing resources in the materials that are the most important to the communities and constituencies that we work with. So that's a run through on some of the highlights from those principles. And I'll switch now, take a little bit of time to talk through some very practical base level things that anybody can do to get started with digital preservation. And so I'll jump into that, and then we should have plenty of time for questions, which is often one of the most interesting places to get into this, because a important part of this is that really individual contexts and situations that really drive issues in digital preservation and questions. And so it'll be great to spend some time talking through those. So where to start? And so here are what I'd offer as the sort of 6 most basic things that any and everybody can do as ways to get involved, to get more active in digital preservation. The very first one is it's often the case that we might not even know everything that we need to be sort of tending to or focused on. So the first bit there is to identify what digital stuff you've got that you really need to keep, whether that's personally or for your organization. And then the second bit there is to start looking at how to get the boxes off the floor, those digital boxes off the floor. And I'll share a resource in this list. There's another resource that's a really great way to do that. So you start getting the work to get the digital boxes off the floor, and then it's important to then schedule out a plan for improving and checking in on things. So one of the things that can happen, and I think we may know well this from a number of situations, is sort of it becomes important. Suddenly it's time to think about digital preservation. So someone works up a digital preservation strategy document or a plan, or establish some set of policies, and then sort of checks that box and moves on to the next thing. But a really essential part of this is thinking about how this becomes sort of a routinized part in an ongoing process to check back in on how those plans are working, how they're being followed through with, all those kinds of things. So that scheduling out that plan for improving things becomes really important. And the fourth thing, and this is really the way to make sure you're able to get those digital boxes off the floor, is to read the NDSA Levels of Digital Preservation's paper and use some of the resources, and I'll show some pictures from that in a second. But what's really great about the NDSA Levels of Digital Preservation as a framework is they very much focused on progressive improvements that can be done at different levels based on your resources and needs. And the fifth one I'd offer is that there's some great communities of practice. The Digital Preservation Coalition is one that I'd point to sort of the strongest. The National Digital Stewardship Alliance is another great one, domestically within the United States, that anyone can sort of join and follow in on. There's great folks you can connect with and follow on Twitter that are associated with those groups, get their email lists, think about joining their working groups, those kinds of things. And the sixth thing I'd offer is that free version of the Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation is up online, and it's also quite likely that you've got access to it through a number of different libraries as part of Project Muse. So the book itself can be a useful resource for sort of thinking about and refining your own practice and approach. And so with that, here's a screenshot of the resources that are up on the NDSA's website about the levels of digital preservation. you can see down at the bottom there how the levels actually work, that there's, levels 1 through 4 focused on issues like storage and geographic location or file fixity and data integrity. So you can actually use that resource as a way to help plan and prioritize where to invest your resources and effort in improving your practice. And so that is a tour through sort of overall approach and set of ideas from the theory and craft of digital preservation. I hope you find it useful. And at this point, I'm happy to turn it over into question time, which might produce some of the most interesting parts of our time together here. So if you have any questions about any of the principles or axioms that I shared, or even some potentially more concrete issues that you're struggling with, I think we can pivot into going through those through the rest of the time that we have available here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Owens. Thank you, Trevor. And we do have the chat open. I was able to link the NDSA guide and also the preprint for your book there in the chat. So if anybody doesn't have that open, you can find it there. Does anybody have any questions? Want to go ahead and break the ice and be the first question asker here with our session with Dr. Owens? Give folks a few minutes to type some things up. One of the things that I really appreciate about your overview and your work, Dr. Owens, is the really cutting through the noise and making the large ideas really accessible, and that also can help us share with colleagues or administrators that we need to collaborate with to get this work done, who aren't we'll say finger on the pulse of digital preservation every day, because that's not in their jobs, descriptions, but we do need to work with them. So thank you for that. Okay, so from Amber, Amber Bales, can you share some tips on getting a handle on creating an inventory of digital assets?
Sure. So the starting point I'd suggest there is to think broadly about the kinds of material that your organization is responsible for. And then to kind of build that list and vet it with others as a starting point. So an example that would come up frequently in this kind of context is it may well be the case that, someone working in a digital preservation unit at a academic library or something like that, they know about, let's say it's the electronic theses and dissertations, the things that are going into, say, a DSpace instance or something like that. That may be very forefront of their mind. They might not be thinking about, say, materials that the organization has purchased copies of through e-resource agreements or something like that, right? And so kind of the act of actually writing down at a very high level what those materials are and responsibilities around them can be a really important way of facilitating things. And I think it's great to start at that really high level about sort of what types of material is the organization responsible for, before then drilling down into getting, actual lists of assets and things like that. So I think that's another note that comes up in this context too. A lot of library, archives, and museums organizations also have sort of a split between kind of records management questions and questions about whether or not records of the institution themselves constitute collections. So those are the kinds of things that I think it's really important to facilitate in kind of those high-level conversations before drilling down into actually inventorying the assets themselves. When it comes to inventorying assets themselves, if you're in a really small organization, like places that have 1 or 2 staff, it may well be the case that you're talking about things in shared drives, or you're talking about things that are backed up with Google Drive or any number of other systems like that someone's using as sort of cloud storage. And in those cases, it's generally possible to get exports of lists of things or be able to track them at sort of directory levels. But in many other cases, it might be that you have several different platforms or tools that you're using to manage digital content, and sort of getting a handle for what they can export and share about the actual status of files that are stored within them is sort of somewhat customized to each of the systems or tools that you tend to be working with. But it's a great question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do we have anybody? Oh, good, perfect timing. Thank you, Adam. And Amber says thank you in the chat. Adam Wanter asks, can you talk a little bit about how the 16 axioms were put together? Were there things you thought were important to address but didn't fit, etc.? And are you working on anything new?
Sure. So the axioms part of the book and the introduction actually came together sort of at the end. I had sort of written my way through the whole book and was trying to come back to what I should write up as an introduction for the book, and started to think, oh, it would be really important to kind of suss out what some high level principles are. Because I think one of the things that makes them sort of axiomatic in that case too is that they're not necessarily, they're both sort of taken as a given for the starting point for the work, and also sort of reinforced and understood through context. So in that case, overall, another way to say it is they're kind of a summary of the book, but also sort of a principled stance that you sort of take from the beginning to become the part of why the book exists too. So it really does have everything that I wanted to have in it. I think when I originally shared them, I published all of everything in the book in drafts online in advance of publishing it. And if I'm remembering right, it was actually 15 originally, and there was one that I had some reviewers come back and say, "Oh, that actually sounds like two different things." So that one split into two and became 16. Which is fun too, because it's like it can be like 16 bits or something like that. So there's an inherent joy that comes from doing things divisible by 8 for digital work. But that's some context on where they came from, and they kind of, in some ways, they move through the structure of the book towards a conclusion too. So kind of starting with some really first principles there about the repository is not a piece of software. And then I didn't share it, but the 16th one is that digital preservation requires thinking like a futurist. And that is more or less what the last chapter of the book is, that we're all kind of thinking about and needing to think and imagine about what, computing and access to information is going to look like in 100 years. And so when we do get into situations where it's quite possible that keyboards may not be the primary interface for interacting with digital content. In many ways, they already aren't, right? That we spend a lot of time talking into digital devices at this point, and or using virtual keyboards on smartphones and things like that. So in the long run, all of those kinds of things become important. But that futurist point is sort of tucked down there at the last point in 16, because that kind of fits with where it shows up in the book. But it's also kind of less foundational than the ones that come towards the top are.
Excellent, thank you. And are you working on anything new that you'd like to share?
Oh, sure. So as mentioned in the intro, the current book I'm working on is called After Disruption, A Future for Cultural Memory. And there's actually drafts of that all up online on my website that anyone can read and comment on too. It's due to the press in December, so I'm in the kind of final stages of writing that up. And broadly speaking, that book is about reflecting on what, to some extent, it's got a little bit of a memoir-ish kind of component to it, where I started my work professionally in a digital humanities center, sort of really focused on thinking a lot about disruptive innovation and the way that digital information was going to upend or transform the work of cultural heritage organizations. But since that time, I've really come to see the way that frame of mind and approach to things actually undermines a lot of the work and nature of organizations. That sort of suggests that the expertise for how to imagine and enact our future exists elsewhere, is not to be found within libraries, archives, and museums. And so the book sort of starts out with a set of ideas around sort of data-driven thinking, Silicon Valley approaches to thinking about labor and organizations that I increasingly find problematic, and then pivots to suggest and draw on a lot of work around maintenance, care, and repair as frameworks for thinking about the future of work and cultural organizations. So that's sort of the gist of that. And anyone is welcome to go check out that online in its draft state, and then it'll probably be about a year till it comes out in print.
Excellent. And I actually was able to link a page from your site that has a link to that in the chat if anybody wants to take a look at it there. And thank you, Marilee, also for dropping a link to the Society of American Archivists manuscript repository section's Jump In initiative. There's a report there linked in the chat. And we have a question from Anne in the chat also. Anne Reichbos, thank you. Coming from a university archivist, large institutions are using more and more external systems to create, manage, and store data and records from SharePoint to Teams to Canvas, etc. How do you suggest getting started with strategies for addressing the appraisal, acquisition, etc. of data in these complex systems?
Great, and I'll first off just chime in to underscore that the resource that Marilee shared is great and is I think a lot of the things that came from the sort of walk before you run approaches to developing and managing foreign digital content are hyper relevant still, and the kind of fundamentals of that have not changed. There's more and more tools like BitCurator that have advanced and developed further, but they are the fundamentals are all the same and very much aligned with what I'm suggesting here. But Anne's question is fantastic, so thank you for asking it. It is increasingly the case that all kinds of organizations, whether large or small, really are not managing, are working across cloud-based software as a service system environments. And it is challenging to think about how to approach records and data management issues within those. It's, I think a key point, and I think this comes through in the levels of digital preservation documentation, is it's not necessarily essential that we each have our own sort of fully controlled stack of technologies for preserving and managing information. It's quite, the use of cloud systems is actually quite great in terms of dealing with things like geographic redundancy and sort of the kinds of disaster threats that come up. And so there's a lot of really good things that come from cloud-based systems. But as Anne's pointing out, you've got, materials like these Teams recordings. There's a recording of this that may exist, right? What's the plan for that? How does that fit into things? Platforms like SharePoint that might be actually hosted by your organization or be sort of bought solely as software as a service, where you don't have access to you're not necessarily, running and managing the files in your own organization. And so I think one of the biggest things there, and this I think relates in many ways more to records management issues, but it's increasingly also true for digital collection systems. Having plans for how you get the data that's essential in and out of those systems and sort of forward migrate them becomes hugely important, especially because when you're in a situation where like a contract might expire and then all the data might be deleted, that is a much more kind of pressing situation for sort of upkeep and management of those. I think at the same time, the more that it's possible to sort of weed out which of these platforms really it's essential to keep data from, or set up the kind of practices around what needs to get exported when and managed and kept, the better. So if there are, in the situation of something like Teams, having records management practices about exporting data or sort of approaching it at an enterprise level, all those kinds of things are really important. But they're even more challenging in situations where it could well be the case that you have a state level license to some system, as opposed to, or a regional one or something like that. And so you may not have a lot of control over parts of it. In which case you may need to develop approaches that are much more directly based on practical and pragmatic ways that people export on a routine basis the data that's the most important, and then move it into systems that you do have a bit more control over. But it's only getting more complex, and I think the broader point with it too is that it often, to underscore some points from earlier in the talk, many of these systems in theory are supposed to make our lives significantly easier, or remove the kinds of work that someone might need to do to organize, manage, assess this kind of content. But in fact, there's even more work that's needed to do that across a wide range of systems, particularly when they can sort of blink in and out of existence based on contracts or those sorts of things at a fast basis. And so it actually becomes, again, I think one of the key points here is how to staff and support the work that's required for this, because if it's not, then there will just be, big sets of data that go, that sort of blink out every so often. And that's just a risk that we're all tacitly, in that case, agreeing to accept.
Thank you. Great question, Ann. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Ben Daigle. I think I'm gonna pop my camera on just to be courteous. Hopefully this will work. Maybe not. There we go. Hi everybody, and thanks, Trevor. I appreciate your talk. Actually, I'm not sure I have a fully formed question here, which is why I'm gonna just speak it out. Maybe it'll come out, but it's related to your comment there before. I'm just curious if you've had a chance to digest some of the recent reports. Like this is kind of a staffing question, something I've been thinking a lot about. Both the NDSA staffing survey report, which kind of fairly dire, dire depiction of the state of decentralized staffing models, where librarians and archivists who might, particularly in smaller institutions, may have be wearing many hats and many roles, and one of which is digital preservation and finding ways to take some of those, just take some of the actions that you're talking about in lieu of waiting for the big windfall of funding or the next system to come around. So I've been thinking a lot about that report, but also the a recent report about the durability of commercial systems from Ithaca S&R that came out that seemed to suggest some challenges to the long-term viability of some of the not-for-profit and nonprofit systems from a variety of organizations that provide these systems, both for funding reasons and for commercial competitive reasons. Anyway, like I said, I'm not sure this is a fully formed question. I guess I'm just curious about your thoughts about some of these recent reports and decentralized staffing versus centralized staffing. I think those are some big challenges that I've been thinking through.
Sure. And so on the first bit on sustainability of systems and tools, I think an important thing with all of it, the most important thing when we accept that all the tools are sort of transitory, that they're here today but they'll be gone tomorrow, or that sort of today and tomorrow becomes, it's sort of a question of how long of a time frame we're looking at, right? Like which of these things are going to be running in X amount of time. And so on one level, if there are sort of tools that you're just using here and there to move things around, that's one issue. I'm less concerned about that. But when it does come to the sustainability of actual cooperative organizations or entities that have taken on responsibilities for enduring long-term access, then that becomes much more concerning. And I think there are good reasons to be concerned about that, just because of the costs that are associated with sort of operating organizations like that. I think it's also a challenging thing where so much of the models for sort of distributed approaches to digital preservation across organizations require kind of clarifying and making clear what the actual benefits of certain services are to the organizations themselves. So it's, I think, clarifying what's at stake and sort of being able to support that kind of long-term thinking is challenging when organizations are really pressed to sort of justify a lot of aspects of their work and ongoing existence constantly too. So those are, I think, big challenges, but I do think it's worth parsing that there's two separate things that give different levels of concern. One, are specific tools or software systems sustainable? I'm a little less concerned on that front because we inherently know that software systems aren't sustainable, that they're here today, they sort of transition, and we need to be planning for moving between them over a long period of time. But on the broader thing, the set of questions about sort of organizational sustainability for organizations that are stepping up to take on these responsibilities. That I think is more concerning and really requires more attention and input. Then on the second question about centralized or decentralized approaches, and about the sort of extent to which we're pushed to do more with less in many cases, I think there are a lot of things that it makes sense to decentralize, so that sort of base level work around managing collections really needs to get folded into the ongoing operations of all kinds of parts of our organization. I think it's worth underscoring, right, that while it may have made sense to have AV archivists be different than all the rest of the archivists, that digital information is not like AV, right? It's not like a niche category of content or material, or one that might be really important for many organizations, but it is functionally everything is going to have digital aspects to it. So if you are operating in archives, it's not really going to make sense to have sort of like the people that do the digital stuff kept as a separate group from the people that do the rest of the stuff, since the digital stuff is going to is in many cases already, half of all the stuff that's coming in or something like this, right? So I think a lot of questions about org structure end up getting tied into questions about how the collecting mission and function of an organization. But the last bit I'd add on that front too is that I think one of the things that's really important to parse with this is that I think many organizations, when they're kind of in their kind of stressed state that they're in, keep trying to dream up more and more services they might offer as a way out of that. So the level of the kinds of activities and services that organizations are taking on seem to me in many cases to be sort of inherently unsustainable based on the staffing levels and resourcing that they have. So I think there's a fair amount of sort of tough inward-looking work that needs to happen in organizations to really think about what they actually have the resources to support and run. And I think part of that too can be a question of how to enable an organization to try something out and explore different potential services, right? But not sort of establish that those are ongoing commitments forever. So the actual process by which things get tried out as pilots. But I think we're all likely familiar with the 20-year running pilot project or something that never really formally got blessed to be something the organization has made a long-term commitment to, but sort of de facto became one. And so I think there's a lot of challenges around how to get organizations to think through that kind of work. And one of the resources I'd suggest here is the Digital Preservation Coalition does have some great materials set up for sort of making the case around digital preservation to executives and organizations, or sort of groups that serve those kinds of executive functions, right? So in many cases, libraries and archives are sort of units within broader institutional organizations, and so those kinds of cases need to get made organizationally as well. And so those DPC resources are, I think, a great go-to for helping think through kind of that case-making work.
Thank you.
Great comments. Thank you very much. And thank you, Emily, for linking the NDSA staffing survey in the chat. And Greg Colati also has a comment in the chat that smaller institutions have a different dilemma, where and how to access digital preservation systems that are beyond their ability to create and manage. And noting that vendors are eager to sell quote unquote solutions that are more commercial than altruistic. And it sounds like this is also maybe linked to the statement that you made, Trevor, about coming up with new strategies and new ideas and new things that kind of spiral out of control. But can you speak on that a little bit, or do you have a response to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's an example that I would bring up in this case that I think is relevant, but from a very different kind of context, is in the Innovation Delusion, which is a fantastic book by two historians around sort of a lot of ideas and beliefs around innovation in our culture. The historians do a great job of delving into some things around a maintenance mindset that are, I think, really powerful for us to think about. But one of the examples, they even go into things around municipal sustainability and things like this, right? And so an example they draw up, which I think has really interesting parallels to us, is there's an example of a city that has a water system that they're having trouble maintaining, and it needs some really critical maintenance on it. But the only thing they could get funding for is if they radically overhaul the system and actually get something that's actually far more expensive and complex to maintain in the long run. And so a fair number of municipalities will do this. They will, go for the grant that's to sort of dramatically level up what they're going to do, and it'll be great because for 5 years they'll have this even greater capacity to have this water management system. But 5 years after that, they'll be in a situation where the maintenance costs on that new thing, which is even bigger and better, is now double or triple what the maintenance costs the deferred maintenance costs they were looking at originally. And so I think one of the biggest challenges there is to think about these issues and situations not as sort of near-term problems, but much longer-term problems. And so in that case, actually working through with staff in an organization to think through, are we signing up for something that's even less sustainable in the long run by getting this overhaul, or is there something more basic that would meet our needs to work with the more sort of pressing risks that we're dealing with?
Yeah, that is a great analogy. Thanks. Greg noted that in the chat too, and we were able to find one copy of the innovation solution in the Ohio Link catalog. It's at Case Western Reserve circulating. So if you are fast, you can reserve it before anybody else does. Otherwise, I'm sure your local library has a copy of it as well. We might have some ebook copies. So we've got about 10 more minutes left of time for a couple more great questions. If anybody is sparked for questions or comments or anything else that they would like to share. One thing that you got me thinking of when you were talking about thinking of things as futurists, like what we're going to need to address in the next 100 years, which obviously is unknowable, but we do the best we can, with our human minds. I'm thinking a lot about climate change and impact of digital services, and this is not related to digital preservation necessarily, but we're hearing a lot when it comes to NFTs and Bitcoin and decentralized architectures, the impact on the environment from the computing and the systems, down to from the power that it takes to run the systems down to the actual rare earth minerals that are being mined and the political instabilities that those sorts of business models, I don't want to say ethics even, business models are putting into place. So how does that fit in when we're thinking about digital preservation and the work that we're doing when it comes to thinking ahead for the future and wanting to do the best that we can with what we have available to us right now?
Sure. So on the sort of blockchain front, I think David Rosenthal, who's if you're unfamiliar, is a really central computer engineering figure for thinking about long-term access to digital or to information. Sort of the mind behind the LOX platform. And David has some fantastic posts up on his blog where he goes way into the weeds about some issues around blockchain and things like NFTs and the sort of technologies there. So, and the relationship to digital preservation. And he's highly skeptical. And I think just has some great reads on that I'd encourage anyone really curious to explore. My take from his read and from others is that I think in terms of blockchain's relationship to digital preservation, it makes it for the or NFTs. So in the case of NFTs, we're really talking about like a technology for digital receipts, which is interesting, but not particularly related to issues around sort of enduring access to digital information. There's some really smart thinking around distributed data management and things like that could potentially involve some blockchain technologies, but the proof of work function of them is deeply problematic, which sort of requires constant compute work and resources. That's the kind of environmental conditions issue there. The effect that has on the climate is dramatic. There's an attempt to get proof of stake to take off as a different way of approaching that, but there's also a lot of skepticism within those communities about. There's reasons that that proof of work has been an important cornerstone of that work to begin with. So that's all to say there's a lot of like complexity and technical issues there, but for the most part, I think it's is sort of orthogonal to the work that's at hand for us, and in some ways kind of persists in large part as a distraction from really persistent things that we know we need to deal with. And the last point I draw out on that front too is that your question more broadly about climate change, that is going to be a huge factor shaping the thinking about the future of preservation, digital or otherwise. I think there's some really great work that the Park Service has done, a number of different organizations. Archivists Respond to Climate Change, that would be another one I'd point to, delving into just how much of the sort of cultural heritage institution infrastructure is going to be potentially literally underwater in the next 50 or 100 years. The higher and higher rates of crises or disaster threats, and then sort of the kind of destabilization globally that comes from what those changes are going to bring. So I think there's a lot of issues there that are going to sort of, can play into a lot of the resource questions that we're talking about, all these kinds of things. We're thinking broadly, and sort of are all the more so make clear why it's important for us to be explaining the value that cultural memory plays socially for the work around this, so that we do continue to resource it in ways that are appropriate to support sort of the really big challenges that we're facing, in the next 50 to 100 years.
Absolutely. And we were able to link those references in the chat if anybody wants to read a little bit more about those. And while we're waiting for everybody, just squeeze out the last bit of your thinking caps. You got a couple more minutes to put something in the chat. Trevor, related to, but not touching on environmental concerns, climate change, we know that's going to impact everything, overshadow everything that we're doing. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some trends that you're seeing, in trends or directions, which understandably those can be two different things, that maybe the digital collections and digital preservation community will be moving in, or if you want to talk about any of the work that's going on at the Library of Congress right now that you're excited about, we've got time for that too.
Sure. I don't know. I have anything particularly interesting to think about in terms of trends. And then in terms of our own work, like many organizations, we have, well, I guess the biggest thing I'd point out from the Library of Congress context is that the most of our work around digital collections is now guided and directed specifically by the agency's digital collection strategy, which follows on from our digital collecting plan, which is a publicly available document, so anyone can check that out. But I think the biggest sort of cornerstone to that is looking at an increasingly sort of E-preferred situation, where for a long time it's been our approach to take E as sort of when E is the only option, we would take E versions of content. And so that's been the case with E-journals or a number of other things, where we'd get E versions of materials as sort of a secondary instance of something. So, we get cataloging and publication books in print, but we would also, when available, get digital copies of them. And in the long run, thinking about a shift to planning for whenever it's appropriate, that E may be the default for acquiring materials. And I think a big part of that, which is an issue for many organizations, is really ironing out approaches and plans for enabling access to on-site only or various kinds of rights-restricted content. And that's true whether it's, you're looking at manuscript collections, and they're increasingly, huge portions of them are coming in a digital format, or we're looking at, general broadly published materials in which there's both a digital and analog instance of them available. So a variety of the things in that document that you link to, thank you, in the chat, really sort of underscore the broad set of issues we're looking at and thinking about.
Fantastic. All of these resources will keep us busy for weeks, I'm sure, which is great. Right. We love that. We love sharing resources with ourselves and with our patrons and our communities as well. So thank you so much. Again, we do have another minute or two if anybody wants to squeak a question or a comment in the chat. But thank you so much, Dr. Owens, for sharing your morning with us and for the work that you're doing. I know that a lot of us are very excited to read the final version of your forthcoming publication. And if anybody wants to follow you, I believe you are, you do have a Twitter account, is that correct?
Yep. So I'm TJ Owens on Twitter.
Great. Great. Okay. We will follow up with you